all discovered by one struggling single mother's desperate attempt to save her condemned home and the crumbling wall that would reveal America's most profitable bootlegging operation preserved beneath her flooded basement for almost a century. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The January rain pounded mercilessly against the windows of the old Victorian house as Sarah Blackwood descended the creaking wooden stairs into what had become her worst nightmare. At 37, she never imagined she'd be fighting to keep the dilapidated home where she and her 2 children had hoped to build a better life after her divorce. But here she stood, ankle-deep in murky water that had been rising for 4 days, clutching a condemnation notice that gave her exactly 72 hours to make the basement habitable or watch the city declare their only asset uninhabitable forever. The flooding had begun during the worst winter storm Chicago had witnessed in decades. What should have been minor seepage during heavy rain had transformed into catastrophe when the neighborhood's century-old drainage system failed catastrophically, sending thousands of gallons of water cascading into the basement of 1923 Lakeview Avenue. The historic home, built in 1892, had weathered over 130 years of Chicago winters, but it wasn't designed to withstand the infrastructure collapse that had overwhelmed their struggling neighborhood. Sarah unfolded the crumpled condemnation notice from her pocket, reading it for the 20th time that morning. The bureaucratic language was cold and impersonal, reducing her family's dreams to a series of housing code violations and structural concerns. Chicago Housing Authority, property unsafe for habitation due to flooding damage, electrical hazards, and potential foundation compromise. Final notice. Compliance required within 72 hours or property will be condemned and demolished. The weight of those words pressed down on Sarah like the gray January sky outside. She surveyed the basement that had once held so much promise, the space where she'd planned to build a playroom for the kids and a small office for her freelance graphic design work. Now it was a disaster zone filled with murky water that carried the detritus of their modest possessions, floating toys, waterlogged furniture, and the scattered remains of the life they'd struggled to build. The irony was crushing. Sarah had spent 12 years working in architectural restoration, understanding historic buildings better than most. She'd purchased this house precisely because she believed her skills could transform the neglected property into a home her family could be proud of. The $245,000 they'd paid had stretched her finances to the breaking point, but the opportunity seemed worth the risk. Now, just 7 months after moving in, they faced losing everything. The economic downturn had hit her family hard. Design projects had dried up, leaving Sarah cobbling together freelance jobs that barely covered their $1,950 monthly mortgage. Her child support payments helped, but the $1,400 monthly income mostly went to utilities, food, and her youngest daughter's dance lessons. Their modest savings had been depleted by the down payment and unexpected repairs the house had required. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mom, this pump isn't powerful enough," called out her teenage son, Ethan, who stood waist-deep in the flooded basement, trying to position a rental pump that seemed woefully inadequate for the task. The motor whined with effort, but the water level barely seemed to move. "We need something industrial grade, and we need to find where all this water is coming from." Ethan was a good kid, 16 years old, with the kind of determined intelligence that reminded Sarah of her own father. Despite being on winter break, he'd volunteered to help rather than spending time with friends. Her younger daughter, Lily, was staying with Sarah's sister while they fought to save their home. Sarah looked around the basement that had once held so much potential. The water was murky and filled with the debris of their accumulated belongings. Family photos documenting birthdays and holidays bobbed next to Christmas decorations they'd carefully stored. Design materials that Sarah had collected over her career floated like shipwreck artifacts. The water had likely ruined the furnace and water heater, creating yet another financial burden they couldn't afford. "Ethan, we can't afford an industrial pump," Sarah replied, her voice heavy with exhaustion and defeat. "The rental on this little one is already $85 a day. We can't get the water out with what we have. I'm afraid we're going to lose the house." She'd done the math obsessively over the past 4 days. The pump rental was already stretching their emergency credit card to the limit. The estimate for professional flood remediation was $18,000, more than their remaining credit and available cash combined. The electrical work needed to bring the basement up to code would cost at least $9,500 more. Even if they could somehow afford the immediate repairs, they'd still need to address the crumbling foundation, the aging plumbing, and a dozen other maintenance issues that had been accumulating since they purchased the property. The house at 1923 Lakeview Avenue had been built during Chicago's golden age when the city's economy was booming and its population growing rapidly. Originally owned by the Harrington family, merchants who had prospered in the dry goods industry, the house had passed through several owners before falling into disrepair in the early 2000s. When Sarah purchased it, the property had been vacant for nearly 4 years, giving her a price she could almost afford in a neighborhood where most homes were well beyond her means. The neighborhood was changing rapidly. What had once been a working-class area was being discovered by young professionals and developers who saw potential in the historic architecture. 5 houses on their block had been purchased by investment companies in the past year, renovated with high-end finishes, and flipped for twice what Sarah had paid for her home. She had watched the transformation with a mixture of admiration for the craftsmanship and anxiety about rising property taxes that would further strain her budget. "Mom, there might be assistance programs for flood victims," Ethan suggested hopefully. "Maybe the city has resources we don't know about." Sarah shook her head, having already explored every available option with the thoroughness of someone fighting for survival. "I've called everyone, Ethan. FEMA says this doesn't qualify as a federal disaster because it's not widespread enough. The city says their emergency funds are exhausted from the bigger floods downtown last month. The Red Cross can provide temporary shelter, but not home repairs. And our insurance." She gestured helplessly at the water surrounding them. "Apparently, this kind of flooding isn't covered under our policy." The insurance situation was particularly infuriating. Sarah had carefully reviewed their homeowner's policy before purchasing, ensuring they had what seemed like adequate coverage, but the fine print contained exclusions that she hadn't fully understood. The policy covered flooding from natural disasters, but specifically excluded flooding caused by municipal infrastructure failure. The city's drainage system collapse was considered an act of government rather than a natural disaster, creating a legal loophole that left them without coverage for exactly the kind of catastrophe they faced. Sarah had spent hours on the phone with the insurance company, explaining their situation to representatives who seemed sympathetic but powerless to help. The claims adjuster who'd visited had been apologetic but firm. Municipal infrastructure failures were explicitly excluded under standard homeowners' policies. If Sarah wanted that kind of protection, she would have needed separate flood insurance, which cost hundreds of dollars annually and had a 30-day waiting period before taking effect. "The housing inspector is coming back tomorrow morning," Sarah continued, her voice thick with emotion. "If this basement isn't dry and the electrical system isn't safe, they'll condemn the house. After that, we're looking at demolition." She'd met the inspector twice already, a tired-looking man named Marcus Wilson, who'd been doing this job for 15 years and had seen every kind of housing disaster Chicago could produce. Wilson had been professional but clear about the stakes. The city couldn't allow families to live in houses with compromised electrical systems and ongoing flooding. If they couldn't resolve the problems within the specified time frame, the house would be declared uninhabitable and scheduled for demolition. The prospect of demolition was almost worse than foreclosure. At least with foreclosure, the house might be sold to someone who could afford to restore it. With condemnation and demolition, the family would lose their down payment and still be responsible for the mortgage on a house that no longer existed. The debt would follow them for years, making it nearly impossible to find another home. Ethan stopped working with the pump and looked at his mother with the kind of maturity that children sometimes display in times of crisis. "Mom, there has to be something we can do. This house probably has history. Maybe there's something special about it that could help us." Sarah appreciated his optimism, but she understood the harsh realities of urban renewal better than a teenager could. The city of Chicago was dealing with aging infrastructure throughout its historic neighborhoods, struggling with limited budgets and an overwhelming number of problems. Condemning flood-damaged houses was often easier and cheaper than helping homeowners navigate complex restoration processes, especially when those homeowners lacked financial resources to hire lawyers or advocates. "I've been noticing something strange about this basement," Ethan continued, unwilling to give up. "The back wall looks different from the others. See how that section curves inward? That's not typical for houses from this era." Sarah had noticed these oddities herself during their short ownership of the house. Her architectural background had made her curious about certain unusual features in the basement construction. She often remarked that the stone walls seemed too elaborate for a residential foundation, pointing out details in the masonry that suggested professional construction techniques from another era. "Different how?" Sarah asked, finding herself curious despite their dire circumstances. "The basement is too deep for a house built in the 1890s, and that back wall, it's different stonework from the rest of the foundation. I've been researching Chicago's history for my school project, and this neighborhood was notorious during Prohibition. There were speakeasies and bootleggers all through this area." The theory wasn't entirely far-fetched. Their neighborhood had been close to Chicago's infamous gangland territory during the 1920s, with speakeasies, illegal distilleries, and bootlegging operations scattered throughout the area. Many residential streets had been developed on land that had previously housed illicit operations, often incorporating secret rooms or hidden passages to evade law enforcement. Sarah had noticed some unusual features in the basement's construction herself. The stone walls were built with a precision typically found in commercial buildings, using carefully fitted limestone blocks rather than the rough fieldstone common in residential foundations of the era. The ceiling was unusually high, nearly 9 feet, and the floor had been laid with thick concrete that suggested the space had been designed for heavy use. "You might be right about the construction," Sarah acknowledged, finding herself examining the basement walls with renewed interest. "But even if this place has historical significance, that doesn't solve our immediate problem. We need dry floors and working electricity, not historical curiosities." Even as she said it, Sarah found herself looking more carefully at the basement construction. The water level had dropped slightly since they'd started pumping, revealing stone walls that did seem unusually sophisticated for a residential foundation. The stonework was precise and professional, with carefully fitted joints and what appeared to be iron reinforcement rods set into the mortar. The construction resembled the historic industrial buildings downtown more than the other residential basements she'd worked in during her restoration career. "Maybe we should focus on getting this water out first, then worry about historical mysteries," she said, trying to redirect Ethan's attention to their practical challenges, while simultaneously wondering if his theories might somehow be relevant to their current crisis. They worked in silence for the next hour, taking turns operating the pump and hauling buckets of water up the basement stairs. The work was exhausting and seemingly endless. For every bucket they removed, more water seemed to seep in from somewhere, not enough to raise the level significantly, but enough to make their progress frustratingly slow. Sarah's back ached from the constant lifting and carrying, and her hands were raw from gripping the bucket handles. The basement held 7 months of family life, and watching their possessions float in the murky water was heartbreaking. She saw Ethan's science competition trophy bobbing near the stairs, Lily's collection of stuffed animals floating past, and the Christmas decorations they'd carefully stored after celebrating their first holiday in the house. Most painful were the family photographs, albums chronicling their life together, likely ruined beyond salvage. As the afternoon light began to fade, Sarah realized they'd made minimal progress. The water level had dropped perhaps 6 inches, but the basement was still largely flooded, and the electrical systems remained dangerously submerged. The furnace, water heater, and electrical panel were all below the water line, creating safety hazards that would need to be addressed before the house could be considered habitable again. With less than 60 hours remaining until the housing authority's deadline, Sarah was beginning to accept that the house her family had stretched their finances to purchase was about to be lost forever. The arithmetic was brutal and unavoidable. She simply didn't have the money to hire professional water removal services, replace the damaged electrical systems, and address all the other issues required to satisfy the city's requirements. As darkness fell outside, Sarah's best friend, Nadia, arrived with hot meals and fresh coffee, her face showing concern but her eyes still holding a determined spark. She'd been helping whenever she could, bringing supplies and moral support while Sarah and Ethan fought what seemed like a losing battle. "Any progress?" she asked, setting down the food containers and a thermos of coffee. "Not enough," Sarah replied honestly. "The pump is too small, and the water keeps coming in. We're fighting a losing battle." Nadia kicked off her shoes and rolled up her pants, preparing to join them in the flooded basement, despite having worked a full shift as a nurse. Her dedication to Sarah's family had never wavered, even when Sarah's marriage had fallen apart and their financial situation became precarious. "We're not giving up," she said firmly. "This is your home, and we're going to fight for it until the very last minute." As Nadia descended the basement stairs, Ethan called out from the far corner where he'd been working, "Mom!" "Nadia, I think there's something you need to see." He was standing near the rear wall of the basement, where the receding water had revealed what appeared to be a section of wall that didn't match the rest of the basement. The stone pattern was different, where most of the wall was laid with uniform limestone blocks. This section showed a rectangular outline of different stones fitted together in a way that suggested they could be moved. Sarah waded over to where Ethan was standing, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The rectangular outline was clearly artificial, about 3 feet wide and 6 feet high, with stones that were noticeably different from the surrounding foundation. The joints around the rectangle were filled with a different type of mortar, suggesting that this section had been installed or modified separately from the original construction. "Ethan was right," she said quietly, her voice filled with wonder and growing excitement. "There is something unusual about this basement." Ethan ran his hands along the edges of the rectangular outline. "Mom, this looks like some kind of doorway or access panel. Do you think there could be a room or passage behind it?" Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. If Ethan was right about their basement having been part of a Prohibition-Era operation before the house was modified, this rectangular outline might be evidence of that earlier purpose. Could there be a hidden space behind their foundation? Perhaps a storage room or tunnel from whatever illegal operation had occupied the site during the 1920s. But she also understood that discovering hidden rooms in their basement wouldn't solve the immediate problem of flood damage and electrical hazards. Whatever was behind those stones had been there for decades, possibly nearly a century. It would still be there after the city condemned their house and scheduled it for demolition. "Ethan, even if there's something down there, I don't see how it helps us," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Despite her practical concerns, she found herself hoping that whatever lay behind the mysterious stones might somehow provide the miracle they desperately needed. "Mom, what if it's something valuable or historically important?" Ethan persisted, his teenage optimism undimmed by their dire circumstances. "What if it's something that can help us save the house?" Nadia joined them at the rectangular outline, her eyes widening as she examined the stonework. "This definitely looks intentional," she whispered, a smile briefly lighting her tired face. "The construction is too precise to be accidental." Sarah looked at the mysterious rectangular outline in her basement wall, then at the condemnation notice that would make her family homeless in less than 60 hours. The flooding crisis that had seemed like an insurmountable disaster was suddenly charged with unexpected possibility. And with time running out before the housing authority's final inspection, whatever was hidden behind their basement wall might be their last hope. The failing house that had seemed like an overwhelming burden was about to reveal secrets that would change everything. Sarah thought she knew about her home, her neighborhood's history, and the criminal legacy that had been hidden beneath their feet for generations. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for a crowbar, knowing that whatever they discovered next would either save her family's future or confirm that they had lost everything. Sarah's hands trembled as she and Ethan worked to clear the remaining water from around the mysterious rectangular outline in their basement wall. The January evening had settled in completely now, and the single work light they had brought cast eerie shadows across the stone walls that her son had insisted held secrets. What they were about to uncover would either vindicate his theories about their home's hidden history or prove to be another heartbreaking, dead end in their desperate fight to save the house. "Mom, these stones definitely move," Ethan said, his voice tight with excitement and effort as he worked his fingers around the edges of the rectangular section. "Look, this whole section is separate from the rest of the wall. It's like it was designed to be opened." The stones that formed the rectangular outline were indeed different from the surrounding basement wall. Where the regular foundation used uniform limestone blocks laid in a standard pattern, this section consisted of carefully cut granite blocks fitted together with precision that spoke of professional construction. The mortar around the edges was a different color and texture, suggesting it had been installed or modified at a different time than the original foundation. Sarah knelt beside Ethan in the shallow water that remained, running her fingers along the joints between the stones. Her son had been right about so many things regarding their house's construction, and now she was beginning to understand why he'd spent so many evenings down here, measuring walls and examining stonework with the intensity of a young detective. The evidence had been here all along, hidden beneath months of stored boxes and family belongings. "Ethan was right about the construction," she murmured, more to herself than to Nadia. "He kept suggesting our house might have been connected to bootleggers during Prohibition, but I never took him seriously." The theory had seemed like one of Ethan's harmless obsessions, the kind of historical speculation that history enthusiasts love to pursue, but that had little bearing on practical daily life. Sarah had always been focused on more immediate concerns, finding steady design work, keeping up with mortgage payments, and later dealing with the flooding crisis. She'd never had time for theories about 1920s, construction techniques, or the criminal history of their neighborhood. But now, faced with the loss of everything they'd built together, Sarah found herself desperately hoping that Ethan's theories might somehow provide the salvation they needed. If the house did indeed have hidden rooms or tunnels from the Prohibition era, there might be preservation programs or heritage designations that could protect it from condemnation and demolition. "How do we get these stones out?" Ethan asked, examining the tight joints between the granite blocks. Sarah looked around the basement for tools that might help with their investigation. Most of her equipment was either submerged or damaged by the flooding, but she spotted her old pry bar hanging on a pegboard that had remained above the waterline. "Let's try this," she said, retrieving the pry bar. "But be careful. If there's really something behind here, we don't want to damage it." Sarah positioned the pry bar along the edge of one of the granite blocks, working carefully to avoid scarring the stone or damaging whatever might lie behind. The first block resisted her efforts, held in place by decades of settled mortar and the weight of the surrounding stones. "It's moving," Sarah said, her voice strained with effort. "I can feel it starting to loosen." The first stone came free with a grinding sound that echoed through the basement like a door opening after decades of disuse. Behind the granite block was darkness that seemed to extend further back than any of them had expected. Sarah shone her flashlight into the opening, revealing what appeared to be a carefully constructed passageway behind their basement wall. "Ethan, there's definitely a tunnel back there," Sarah said, her voice hushed with amazement. "And it looks dry, completely protected from the flooding." Ethan's eyes widened as he peered into the opening his mother had created. "Mom, this is incredible. We have to get more stones out to see where it leads." Nadia stood transfixed at the sight of the opening in their basement wall. "I can't believe it," she whispered. Ethan was right all along. They worked feverishly to remove more of the granite blocks, driven by a mixture of curiosity and the desperate hope that whatever lay hidden behind their basement wall might somehow help with their dire situation. Each stone they removed revealed more of the passageway, and with each revelation, it became clear that Ethan had been absolutely right about their house's unusual history. The tunnel was approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet high, with arched brick construction that demonstrated professional techniques. The space had been carefully waterproofed and appeared to have remained dry despite the flooding in the main basement. The floor was paved with worn but intact wooden planks, creating a path that led away from the opening into darkness. "This is a bootlegger's tunnel," Nadia gasped, her voice filled with awe. "An actual Prohibition-Era smuggling passage." The tunnel was indeed reminiscent of the hidden passages that had been discovered in other parts of Chicago, remnants of the extensive underground network that had supported the city's thriving illegal alcohol trade during the 1920s. But this discovery raised immediate questions that none of them could answer. Where did the tunnel lead? When had it been sealed off? And why? And perhaps most importantly, could this historical find somehow help them save their home? "This is incredible," Sarah said, though the evidence before her eyes made denial difficult. "How did an entire tunnel system remain hidden in our basement all this time? And why wasn't it in any of the property disclosures?" Ethan was already climbing into the tunnel, his teenage fearlessness overcoming any concerns about the safety or wisdom of exploring the hidden passage. "Mom, Nadia, you need to see this," he called back, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "There's writing on the walls, and the tunnel keeps going." Sarah's practical caution warred with her growing excitement about what they'd discovered. The tunnel had clearly been sealed for decades, possibly since the end of Prohibition, and there was no immediate danger in exploring it. But she also understood that whatever they found down there would complicate their already desperate situation with the housing authority. "Be careful, Ethan," she called as she followed him into the tunnel, Nadia close behind. "We don't know how stable any of this is." The passage felt remarkably dry and well-preserved, considering its age and the flooding that had affected the basement. The walls showed evidence of careful waterproofing, with what appeared to be tar or pitch applied to the brick surfaces to prevent moisture infiltration. The wooden floor was worn but solid, creating a stable surface that had clearly been designed for frequent use. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, Sarah's flashlight beam revealed faded writing on the walls. Names, dates, and what appeared to be delivery schedules had been chalked onto the brick surface. Most had faded to near illegibility, but a few remained clear enough to read. "January 15th, 1924. Shipment from Windsor. 200 cases." Sarah read aloud, tracing the faded chalk marks with her fingertips. "February 3rd, 1924. Special reserve for Valentine's, 50 cases Canadian whiskey." Ethan had moved further ahead, his excitement propelling him deeper into the tunnel. "Mom, it opens up into a bigger room ahead," he called back. "And there's something else here." Sarah and Nadia followed, their flashlight beams crisscrossing in the darkness as they approached what appeared to be a larger chamber. As they entered the space, their lights revealed a scene that seemed frozen in time, a large underground room, approximately 20 feet square, with brick walls and a concrete floor. The chamber was filled with wooden shelving, most of which had collapsed with age, and the remnants of what appeared to be a small-scale distilling operation. Copper pipes, metal tanks, and glass containers lay scattered across the floor, covered in decades of dust but remarkably intact. In one corner stood what appeared to be a large safe, its dark metal surface contrasting with the lighter brick of the walls. This was a speakeasy production room, Nadia observed, her knowledge of Chicago history coming to the fore. They probably made their own alcohol here when shipments from Canada were delayed or intercepted. Sarah approached the safe with growing amazement and apprehension. The discovery of an underground bootlegging operation had been surprising enough, but finding an intact safe raised questions that went far beyond architectural curiosities. This was clearly something that had been deliberately hidden, preserved with the same care and attention that had gone into constructing the tunnel itself. "Then, Nadia, look at this," she said, examining the area around the safe more carefully. The metal door was marked with faded lettering that had once identified its ownership. Sarah could make out partial words that appeared to spell Jenna Brothers and what looked like a bootlegger's emblem, though the paint was too faded to read completely. "The Jenna Brothers were notorious bootleggers in Chicago," Ethan said, his eyes wide with excitement. "We learned about them in history class. They controlled the Little Italy territory during Prohibition and were rivals of Al Capone." Sarah examined the safe more closely. The locking mechanism was sophisticated for its era, a combination dial surrounded by smaller keyholes and auxiliary locking points. Despite its age, the mechanism appeared remarkably well preserved, though she had no idea whether it could still be operated after being sealed for so long. "I don't know if we can open it without the combination," she said, studying the intricate locking system. These old safes were designed to be virtually impenetrable without the correct sequence. Nadia had moved to examine the area around the safe more carefully. "Sarah, look at this," she said, pointing to a small metal plate affixed to the wall beside the safe. The plate appeared to contain numbers and letters arranged in what might be a code or instruction. R17L42R9L28, Nadia read aloud. Could this be the combination? Sarah's heart raced as she considered the possibility. If the plate did indeed contain the combination to the safe, then whatever had been stored inside might still be accessible. But she also understood that opening the safe would cross a threshold from discovering historical architecture to actively engaging with whatever had been hidden by Chicago's notorious bootleggers nearly a century ago. "Should we try it?" she asked, looking to Nadia for guidance. As always in their friendship, Nadia's adventurous spirit balanced Sarah's practical caution, creating a partnership that had weathered numerous challenges. "Sarah, this could be important, not just for you, but for understanding the history of this neighborhood and maybe even the city," Nadia replied. "I think we have to try." With trembling hands, Sarah approached the safe's combination dial. The mechanism was stiff from decades of disuse, but it moved when she applied steady pressure. Following the sequence on the metal plate, she turned the dial right to 17, then left to 42, then right to 9, and finally left to 28. As she completed the sequence, they heard a distinct clicking sound from within the door's mechanism. Sarah held her breath as she grasped the large brass handle and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of metal that had remained stationary for nearly a century, the safe door began to move. The hinges protested but functioned, allowing the heavy door to swing outward into the chamber. As it opened, the beam of Sarah's flashlight revealed a space beyond, filled with objects that gleamed in the artificial light. "Oh my God," Nadia whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's still here. After all this time, it's still here." The safe contained several metal boxes, leather-bound ledgers, and what appeared to be stacks of documents wrapped in waxed paper for preservation. But most striking were the canvas bags arranged on the lower shelves, each marked with faded but still visible printing that read, Jenna Brothers Enterprises, 1924. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes wide with wonder. "Mom, Nadia, are those money bags?" "They look like it," Sarah confirmed, her voice tight with disbelief. Actual Prohibition-era bootlegger money bags. The implications were staggering. If the canvas bags contained what their markings suggested, then what they discovered wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was evidence of what might have been one of the largest bootlegging operations in Chicago's criminal history. Sarah carefully lifted one of the canvas bags, testing its weight. "This is heavy," she said, her voice hushed with awe. I think these might actually contain money." With utmost care, Sarah untied the drawstring that had kept the bag sealed for nearly a century. As she opened it, they all gasped at the contents. Currency, stacks and stacks of it, each bundle neatly wrapped with paper bands marked Jenna Brothers Bank and dated 1924. The bills were old-style currency, larger than modern dollars and featuring imagery that had long since been phased out of circulation. "These are all $100 bills," Sarah said, her voice hushed with awe. "From the 1920s, each one might be worth far more than face value to collectors today." Sarah's architectural restoration background had taught her enough about historical artifacts to understand the implications. Old currency, especially from significant historical periods like Prohibition, often commanded premiums far beyond face value from collectors and museums. These weren't just old bills, they were tangible connections to one of America's most notorious eras of organized crime. "There must be dozens of bags," Ethan whispered, counting the canvas sacks visible on the shelves. "Mom, what does this mean? Why would all this be hidden under our house?" Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. The date on the currency bands, 1924, coincided with a significant event in Chicago's criminal history that Ethan had mentioned during their research into the house's origins. The Jenna brothers had been involved in a violent territory war with other bootlegging gangs, including Al Capone's outfit, that had led to numerous assassinations and a crackdown by federal authorities. "This could be connected to the gang wars of 1924, she said, recalling their previous conversations about Chicago's criminal history. The Jenna brothers were under pressure from both rival gangs and federal agents. They might have hidden their assets to protect them during the conflict. "You think this is actual bootlegging profits?" Nadia asked, the excitement in her voice tinged with concern. "Like actual criminal money?" "It would have been," Sarah clarified, examining one of the leather-bound ledgers she'd retrieved from a shelf. "This looks like a detailed accounting of their operation. Shipments, payments, bribes to officials. It's all here. This is basically the complete financial record of a major Prohibition-era criminal enterprise." Sarah carefully examined one of the $100 bills, feeling its weight and texture. The discovery represented both tremendous opportunity and serious ethical questions. If these assets had indeed been hidden by bootleggers during the 1920s, who did they legally belong to now? Did Sarah and her family have any claim to treasure found on their own property? And perhaps most importantly, could they use this discovery to save their house without getting themselves into legal trouble? As Sarah was contemplating these questions, Ethan had moved to examine the documents wrapped in waxed paper. "Mom, Nadia, you need to see these," he said, carefully unfolding papers that had been preserved for nearly a century. The documents appeared to be letters and business agreements between the Jenna brothers and various associates. As Sarah read through them, her eyes widened with understanding. "These aren't just records of illegal alcohol," she said, with growing excitement. "They document the brothers' attempts to transition to legitimate businesses before things went bad for them. Listen to this." In recognition of the uncertain future of our current enterprises and the increasing pressure from federal authorities, the Brotherhood resolves to establish legitimate holdings in real estate and manufacturing that can withstand scrutiny and provide for our family should current ventures become untenable. The letter was signed by Angelo Genna and dated January 1924, just months before he would be murdered in a gangland assassination that would mark the beginning of the end for the brothers' criminal empire. They were trying to go legitimate, Sarah realized, at least partially. And they were hiding their money not just from the law, but from rival gangs who were moving against them. And look at this, Sarah continued, examining another document. Property deeds for several buildings in this neighborhood, including this house. The Gennas actually owned this property, but through a front company called Lakeview Development Corporation. That explains why the historical records didn't show any connection to them. Sarah carefully replaced the $100 bill in its canvas bag, understanding that their discovery represented far more than a potential financial windfall. It was a physical connection to a tumultuous period in American history when Prohibition had created a parallel economy of illegal alcohol production and distribution, making criminals into millionaires while law enforcement struggled to maintain control. What do we do now? Ethan asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Sarah looked around the underground chamber that had protected its secrets for nearly a century, at the money bags and historical documents that might represent their family's financial salvation or a legal nightmare, and at the condemnation notice that still threatened to make them homeless in less than 48 hours. First, we document everything, she said, the practical architect in her asserting itself. We photograph the tunnel, the money, the documents, everything exactly as we found it. Then we need expert advice before we do anything else. The underground chamber that had hidden its secrets for nearly a century was about to test whether Sarah and her family had the wisdom to handle discoveries that came with both tremendous opportunities and serious responsibilities. The flooding crisis that had threatened to destroy their home had revealed something far more valuable than architectural curiosities: direct connection to history and potentially the resources to secure their future. As they carefully cataloged the contents of the safe, Sarah understood that the next 48 hours would determine not just whether they could save their home, but whether they could honor the historical significance of what they had discovered while also protecting their family's future. The weight of the decision pressed on her shoulders as heavily as the condemnation notice had just hours before. But now there was a glimmer of hope where there had been only despair. "Mom," Ethan said softly as they worked to document their discovery, "I know this is a lot, but I think we found this for a reason. Maybe this house chose us because we'd appreciate its history, not just see it as another property to flip." Sarah smiled at her son's perspective, so different from her own practical approach, yet somehow perfectly complementary. Where she saw structural challenges and historical construction techniques, Ethan saw stories and connections to the past that gave their home meaning beyond its physical dimensions. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but for the first time since the flooding began, Sarah felt something beyond desperation. The house that had seemed like an overwhelming burden had revealed secrets that connected them to Chicago's complex history, offering not just potential financial salvation, but a purpose that transcended their immediate crisis. Whatever came next, they would face it with a newfound understanding of the legacy they had inherited along with their troubled Victorian home. Sarah barely slept that night, her mind racing with the implications of what they had discovered in the underground chamber. The January wind rattled the windows of their old Victorian house as she sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by photographs they'd taken of the tunnel contents, trying to piece together a story that had been hidden for almost a century. With less than 36 hours remaining before the housing authority's final inspection, she needed to understand not just what they'd found, but what it meant for her family's future and her own moral obligations. The documents spread across the kitchen table told a complex story of crime, ambition and transformation that resonated deeply with Sarah's current crisis. The ledgers and letters from the Jenna brothers weren't just historical artifacts. They were a window into the lives of immigrants who had turned to bootlegging during Prohibition as a path to the American dream, only to become entangled in the violence and corruption that defined Chicago's underworld in the 1920s. Sarah found herself studying the detailed accounting records, understanding that each entry represented both illegal activity and the economic reality of an era when government prohibition had created an underground economy worth billions. Angelo Jenna Special Reserve Whiskey, $4,250. Payment to Officer Sullivan, protection for North Side Route, $500. Repair of truck damaged in territorial dispute, $175. The list went on for pages, representing the complex operation that had once thrived beneath the surface of legitimate Chicago society during one of the most tumultuous periods in the nation's history. These weren't just criminal transactions. They represented an alternative economy that had employed thousands during an era of economic uncertainty. The parallels to her family's current situation were striking. Ordinary people caught in circumstances beyond their control, their security threatened by larger forces they couldn't influence. But it was the broader historical context that truly made Sarah understand the significance of their discovery. The early 1920s had been a period of unprecedented social change in American society, with Prohibition creating both moral crusades and criminal empires. The Great Migration was changing the face of northern cities like Chicago, while immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe struggled to find their place in a society that often viewed them with suspicion. Sarah had spent hours the previous evening researching this historical period online, trying to understand the context that had led to the creation of the hidden tunnel beneath their home. What she'd learned had transformed her understanding of the discovery from a simple treasure story into something far more complex and morally nuanced. The Jenna brothers mentioned in the ledgers appeared to have been 6 Sicilian immigrants who had built a bootlegging empire in Chicago's Little Italy neighborhood. Their operation had been remarkably sophisticated, with multiple production facilities, a distribution network that extended across the city, and a system of bribes and protection payments that kept law enforcement at bay. According to the documents they'd found, the brothers had begun to recognize the precarious nature of their criminal enterprise by early 1924. Rival gangs, particularly Al Capone's South Side organization, were becoming more aggressive, while federal authorities were mounting increasingly effective operations against bootleggers across the country. The violence that had once been accepted as part of doing business was escalating to levels that threatened everyone involved. The Jenna brothers' response, detailed in meeting minutes dated February 1924, had been a strategic pivot toward legitimacy. While maintaining their lucrative bootlegging operation, they had begun investing in legitimate businesses, real estate, construction companies, and small manufacturing concerns that could provide cover for their illegal activities while also creating a path toward eventual legitimacy. The tunnel and safe had been part of this strategy. The property at 1923 Lakeview Avenue had been purchased through a front company, providing a secure location to store proceeds and important documents away from their known territory in Little Italy. The tunnel had likely connected to another building or perhaps even the sewer system, allowing for discreet movement of goods and people during a time when gang warfare made the streets increasingly dangerous. But something had clearly prevented them from completing this transition. Historical records indicated that Angelo Jenna had been murdered in May 1924, triggering a cascade of violence that would claim the lives of 3 more brothers before the year was out. The survivors had fled Chicago, leaving behind the assets hidden in the tunnel, a time capsule of criminal enterprise preserved in nearly perfect condition for almost a century. As the morning light began to filter through the kitchen windows, Sarah realized that she needed expert advice to navigate the complex legal, historical, and ethical questions raised by their discovery. The housing authority deadline was approaching rapidly, and she couldn't afford to make decisions based on incomplete information or emotional impulses. "You haven't slept," Nadia observed, entering the kitchen, still wearing her coat from her early morning shift at the hospital. She had returned as promised to help Sarah continue dealing with their extraordinary situation. "How could I?" Sarah replied with a tired smile. "We've got $100 bills from the 1920s in our basement, a hidden bootlegger's tunnel that was never supposed to be found, and less than 36 hours to save our house from condemnation." "I've been thinking," Nadia said, pouring coffee for both of them. "We need to talk to Professor Martinez at Chicago History Museum. She's an expert on Prohibition-Era Chicago and might be able to help us understand the legal implications of what we found." Sarah nodded in agreement. "And we should probably consult a lawyer who specializes in property rights and historical artifacts. This isn't just about finding treasure. It's about doing the right thing with something that has historical significance." They decided to reach out to Dr. Elena Martinez, a prominent historian who had written extensively about Chicago's underworld during Prohibition, and Michael Goldstein, an attorney who specialized in cultural heritage law and had handled several cases involving historical artifacts found on private property. If anyone could help them understand the significance of their discovery and navigate its legal complexities, it would be these experts. As Nadia made the calls, Sarah descended to the basement to check on the water level and the tunnel entrance. The small pump had continued working through the night, and to her relief, the flooding had receded significantly. The electrical systems were still compromised, but the immediate threat of rising water had diminished. The entrance to the underground tunnel remained secure, visible only to someone who knew exactly what to look for among the stone patterns of the basement wall. Ethan joined her in the basement, his eyes bright despite the early hour. Like his mother, he had slept little, the excitement of their discovery keeping his mind racing with possibilities. "Mom, I've been researching the Jenner brothers for my history project," he said, his voice animated with the thrill of connection. "The textbooks never mentioned anything about them trying to go legitimate or hiding their assets. This could change how people understand that whole period of Chicago history." Sarah was struck by her son's perspective. While she had been focused primarily on the immediate practical implications of their discovery, whether it could help them save their home, Ethan had immediately grasped its broader historical significance. His enthusiasm reminded her that what they had found wasn't just potentially valuable in monetary terms. It was a piece of forgotten history that deserved to be understood and preserved. "You're right, Ethan," she acknowledged. "This isn't just about us and our house. It's about understanding a pivotal moment in Chicago's history when bootleggers were trying to transform themselves into legitimate businessmen. It's about immigrants who took illegal paths to success because legal ones were often closed to them." By mid-morning, both Dr. Martinez and Attorney Goldstein had agreed to visit the house immediately. Recognizing the urgency of Sarah's situation, the housing authority inspection was scheduled for the following day. They had rearranged their schedules to give her precious little time to determine how to proceed. Dr. Elena Martinez arrived first, a distinguished woman in her 50s with an energetic manner and an air of contained excitement that became palpable when Sarah showed her the entrance to the underground tunnel. As a historian specializing in Prohibition-Era Chicago, she immediately grasped the significance of what they had discovered. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Martinez breathed as she examined the tunnel and the safe with its Jenner brothers markings. "I've studied Chicago's bootlegging operations for 25 years, and there have always been rumors about missing assets that were never recovered. But to find actual physical evidence preserved in this condition..." The historian carefully documented everything, photographing the tunnel, the currency, and especially the documents left by the brothers. Her expertise allowed her to place their discovery in its proper historical context, confirming much of what Sarah had pieced together from her own research. The Jennas were indeed trying to transition to legitimate business, Dr. Martinez explained, examining the letters with gloved hands. But these documents suggest something quite different from the common narrative, that they were simply violent criminals. They were immigrants trying to build something lasting in America, even if their methods were outside the law. The parallels to modern immigrant experiences were striking. Dr. Martinez explained how the Prohibition era had featured many of the same elements as contemporary society debates about regulation, cultural conflicts between established Americans and new immigrants, and the complex dance between legal frameworks and economic realities. What the Jenna brothers did was clearly illegal, the historian continued. They produced and distributed alcohol during Prohibition, bribed officials, and engaged in violence against rivals. But their intentions, at least according to these documents, eventually shifted toward building legitimate businesses that would outlast the temporary opportunity of bootlegging. Michael Goldstein arrived as Dr. Martinez was completing her initial assessment. The attorney was a sharp-eyed man in his 40s who had built his practice around the intersection of property law and cultural heritage. After viewing the underground tunnel and its contents, he gathered everyone in the living room to discuss the legal implications of their discovery. The legal situation here is complex, Goldstein explained, but not necessarily as dire as you might fear. There are several principles at work that could actually work in your favor. He outlined how the doctrine of treasure trove might apply to their situation, the legal principle that treasures, found hidden on private property, with no clear owner to claim them, may belong to the finder or the property owner, depending on specific circumstances. The fact that these assets have been hidden for nearly a century works in your favor, Goldstein continued. The Jenna brothers are long deceased, their criminal organization disbanded, and any direct claims of ownership extremely difficult to establish. Additionally, statutes of limitations on any crimes committed in 1924 expired long ago, meaning there's no criminal liability to consider. However, Goldstein emphasized that the historical and cultural significance of the discovery created both opportunities and obligations. This isn't just currency. It's a historical archive that documents a previously unknown chapter in American history. That creates certain ethical considerations that go beyond strict legal requirements. The attorney suggested a balanced approach, one that would respect the historical significance of the find while also acknowledging Sarah's rights as the property owner who had discovered the tunnel. The currency itself has significant value both as face value and as historical artifacts, but the documents may be even more valuable from a historical perspective, he explained. There's a strong case for preserving the historical record, while also recognizing your legitimate claim to at least a portion of the financial value. As Dr. Martinez and attorney Goldstein continued their assessment, Sarah was startled by a knock at the front door. She opened it to find Marcus Wilson, the housing authority inspector, standing on her porch a day earlier than scheduled. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his expression professional but not unkind. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check on your progress with the remediation. Has the flooding situation improved?" Sarah's heart sank. They weren't prepared for an early inspection, not with experts still examining the underground tunnel and no decisions yet made about how to proceed. But she also recognized an opportunity to potentially gain more time. "Mr. Wilson, something unexpected has happened," she said carefully. "We've discovered what appears to be a historically significant structure beneath our basement wall. We have experts here right now assessing it." Wilson's professional demeanor gave way to surprised curiosity. "What kind of structure?" Sarah invited him in, introducing him to Dr. Martinez and attorney Goldstein. The historian quickly explained the significance of what they'd discovered, her academic credentials lending immediate credibility to the situation. "This is a historically significant find," Dr. Martinez explained. "A previously unknown Prohibition-Era tunnel and safe belonging to the Jenna brothers, with intact documents that could change our understanding of Chicago's bootlegging history. It would be a tremendous loss to Chicago's historical record if this house were condemned before proper archaeological documentation could take place. Marcus Wilson listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. As a housing inspector, his primary concern was safety and code compliance, but he was also a lifelong Chicagoan with respect for the city's rich history. "The flooding is the immediate concern," he said after a moment. "Has that situation improved?" "Significantly," Sarah confirmed, leading him to the basement to show the progress they'd made. The water level had receded considerably, though the electrical system still needed inspection and likely repair. After examining the basement and being shown the entrance to the underground tunnel, Wilson made a decision that gave Sarah precious breathing room. "Given the historical significance of this discovery, I can recommend a 14-day extension on the condemnation notice," he said. "That would give you time for proper assessment and documentation of the historical site. However, you'll still need to address the electrical hazards and complete the flood remediation within that time frame." The extension was a reprieve, but not a solution. Sarah still needed funds to complete the necessary repairs, and she had yet to determine how to proceed with the tunnel contents. But the additional time would allow her to make these decisions thoughtfully rather than in a desperate rush. After Wilson left, Dr. Martinez made a suggestion that caught everyone by surprise. "The Chicago History Museum has funds for the preservation of significant historical discoveries," she explained. "Given the importance of these documents and artifacts, I believe I could arrange for a preservation grant that would cover the immediate repairs needed to save this house from condemnation." "You could do that?" Sarah asked, hardly daring to hope. "The alternative would be losing access to this historical site completely," Dr. Martinez replied. "From an academic perspective, preserving this discovery is worth far more than the cost of basement repairs and electrical work." Attorney Goldstein nodded in agreement. "And in terms of the tunnel contents, I would recommend a balanced approach. The historical documents should be preserved in an appropriate academic or museum setting, with the Blackwood family credited as the discoverers." "And the money?" Sarah asked the question they'd all been considering since the discovery. "That's where we can create a fair compromise," Goldstein suggested. "Some portion should be preserved for historical exhibition alongside the documents. But there's a strong legal case that as the property owner who discovered this treasure, you have rights to a significant portion of the financial value." The prospect of financial relief from their discovery was tempting, but Sarah exchanged a look with Ethan that reflected their shared values. Throughout their lives together, she had taught her children that integrity mattered more than money, that doing the right thing sometimes required personal sacrifice. What would be the right thing to do? Sarah asked, voicing the question that had been weighing on her mind since they'd first opened the safe. These assets were obtained illegally, even if the Jennas were trying to go legitimate. Just because that was nearly a century ago, does that change our obligation? Dr. Martinez considered the question thoughtfully. The victims of the Jennas' crimes are long gone, as are the brothers themselves. But the historical value of understanding this transitional moment in Chicago's history, when immigrants were trying to find legitimate paths forward from criminal beginnings, that principle remains relevant today. "What if," Ethan suggested, "we used a portion of the value to establish something that honors immigrant struggles? Something that helps families trying to build better lives in Chicago, the way the Jennas were attempting to do, but through legal means?" The idea resonated with everyone present. A fund that would honor the complex history of immigrant experiences while addressing contemporary needs would create meaning from their discovery beyond personal gain. By evening, a plan had begun to take shape. The Chicago History Museum would provide an emergency preservation grant to cover the immediate repairs needed to save Sarah's home, allowing her to address the flooding damage and electrical hazards before the extended deadline. In exchange, the family would provide the museum with exclusive access to document and study the underground tunnel and its historical contents. The documents and a representative selection of the currency would be preserved in the museum's archives, with plans for a special exhibition that would tell the story of the Jenner brothers and their attempted transition from bootlegging to legitimate business during the tumultuous years of Prohibition. The Blackwood family would be prominently credited with the discovery, with Ethan invited to participate in the historical research as an intern, an opportunity that thrilled the history-loving teenager. As for the remaining currency, Attorney Goldstein would establish a trust that would serve two purposes: providing for the Blackwood family's financial security, including funds to fully restore their historic home, and creating a foundation that would support Chicago immigrant families facing housing insecurity and economic hardship. From bootlegging to building futures, Sarah read aloud from the mission statement they had drafted for the foundation. "I think the Jenner brothers would approve of how we're honoring their legacy." Nadia squeezed her hand, her eyes reflecting the same mixture of relief, pride, and purpose that Sarah felt. "We're not just saving your home," she said softly. "We're continuing what they tried to start, helping immigrant families build something lasting, just through better means." Ethan looked around the living room of the house that had seemed like such a burden just days before, now transformed into the centerpiece of an unexpected journey through Chicago's complex history. "Mom," he said thoughtfully, "sometimes the biggest treasures aren't the ones that are hidden. They're the ones that are shared." As Sarah hugged her son, she understood that the flooding crisis that had threatened to destroy their home had instead revealed something far more valuable than canvas bags of old currency: a connection to history, a sense of purpose, and the knowledge that sometimes salvation comes from unexpected places, including behind the walls of your own basement. The next 14 days unfolded in a whirlwind of activity that transformed not just Sarah Blackwood's home, but her understanding of her place in Chicago's rich tapestry of history. The museum preservation grant arrived within 48 hours, providing the immediate funds needed to address the flooding damage and electrical hazards that had threatened their home with condemnation. Professional remediation crews worked alongside Sarah, who put her architectural restoration experience to good use, directing efforts to protect both the historic structure of the house and the underground tunnel that had become the centerpiece of their unexpected journey. By the time Marcus Wilson returned for his follow-up inspection, the basement was not only dry, but significantly improved. New electrical systems had been installed to code, the foundation had been properly sealed against future water infiltration, and a custom access point had been created to allow continued study of the underground tunnel while maintaining the structural integrity of the house. "This is remarkable progress, Ms. Blackwood," Wilson said, clearly impressed as he signed off on the inspection form that officially removed the condemnation threat. "Most homeowners would have given up when faced with the situation you were in 2 weeks ago." "We had help," Sarah acknowledged, thinking of the unprecedented coalition that had formed around their discovery: historians, legal experts, museum administrators, and city officials who had recognized that some things transcended bureaucratic boundaries. "And we had motivation. This house isn't just a building to us. It's our family's future and now a piece of living history." The underground tunnel and its contents had indeed proven to be historically significant beyond initial expectations. Dr. Martinez had assembled a team of experts from various disciplines: Prohibition historians, archaeologists, document preservation specialists, and currency experts to properly catalog and analyze everything found in the tunnel. The currency alone represented one of the most significant Prohibition-era discoveries in recent Chicago history. The collection included over $310,000 in pre-1928 large-format bills, most in remarkably good condition, with several rare specimens that had been previously unknown to collectors. Beyond their considerable face value, the historical and collector significance of these bills made them even more valuable. with some individual pieces potentially worth thousands to the right institutions or collectors. But it was the documents that generated the most academic excitement. The Jenner brothers' detailed records provided unprecedented insight into the inner workings of bootlegging operations during Prohibition. Letters between the brothers revealed how they had navigated the complex world of Chicago's criminal underworld while simultaneously planning their transition to legitimate business, a narrative that challenged the simplistic portrayal of gangsters from that era. These men weren't just one-dimensional criminals. Dr. Martinez explained during a presentation at the Chicago History Museum that the entire Blackwood family had been invited to attend. They were complex individuals shaped by the limited opportunities available to Sicilian immigrants in 1920s America, who turned to bootlegging when Prohibition created an illegal market worth billions, and who ultimately sought to transform their ill-gotten gains into legitimate enterprises before violence claimed most of them. The historical parallels to modern immigrant experiences were not lost on anyone. The documents described prejudice and limited opportunities that would sound familiar to many of today's immigrant families, the struggle to build security in a new country, the tension between old-world values and new-world pressures, and the complex moral choices faced by those trying to create better lives for their children with limited resources and opportunities. Attorney Goldstein had successfully navigated the complex legal issues surrounding the discovery, crafting an agreement that balanced historical preservation with recognition of the Blackwood family's rights as property owners and discoverers. The Chicago History Museum would receive the complete document archive and a representative selection of currency for permanent preservation and exhibition. In exchange, the Blackwood family would retain ownership rights to a portion of the financial value, with provisions for its responsible management. Most significantly, the agreement established the New Beginnings Foundation, a nonprofit organization funded by a percentage of the discovery's value. The foundation would focus on providing housing assistance and business startup grants to immigrant families in Chicago, continuing in a legitimate way the Jenner brothers' unfulfilled ambition to create lasting prosperity for immigrant communities. 6 months after their discovery, Sarah stood in the Grand Hall of the Chicago History Museum, where a special exhibition titled "From Bootleggers to Builders: The Jenner Brothers and Chicago's Immigrant Dream" was being unveiled to the public. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a life-sized recreation of the Underground Tunnel, complete with a replica of the safe and interactive displays that told the story of Prohibition and the immigrants who sought various paths, both legal and illegal, to achieve the American dream. "I never imagined we'd be part of something like this," Sarah whispered to Nadia as they watched visitors entering the exhibition space. Their names were prominently featured in the exhibition credits, with special recognition for Ethan, who had contributed to the historical research as part of his internship with Dr. Martinez's team. "It's surreal," Nadia agreed, still sometimes finding it difficult to believe how dramatically their circumstances had changed. The home that had once been on the verge of condemnation was now not only saved but designated as a historical landmark, providing both protection from future development and significant property tax benefits that made their long-term ownership secure. The partial allocation of the discovered currency, carefully managed by financial advisors arranged through attorney Goldstein, had provided enough funds to complete the restoration of their historic home, establish college funds for both children, and create a financial cushion that allowed Sarah to be selective about design projects rather than taking whatever work she could find to make ends meet. But it was the establishment of the New Beginnings Foundation that had given the family the greatest sense of purpose and meaning from their discovery. Sarah had been asked to serve on the foundation's board, bringing her practical experience with housing issues and historic restoration to help guide the organization's work. The foundation had already provided assistance to 31 Chicago immigrant families facing housing insecurity, continuing the legacy of community support that the Jenner brothers had begun in their own problematic way nearly a century earlier, Dr. Martinez approached the family as they toured the exhibition, her academic demeanor giving way to genuine enthusiasm. "The response has been extraordinary," she told them. "We've had interest from Prohibition historians across the country. This discovery is changing how we understand that entire period of Chicago history." The exhibition included an entire section dedicated to the discovery itself, with photographs showing the flooded basement that had led the Blackwoods to find the hidden tunnel. This narrative thread of a modern single, mother struggling against financial hardship and housing insecurity, only to discover evidence of similar struggles from nearly a century earlier, had resonated deeply with both academic audiences and the general public. "People connect with your story," Dr. Martinez explained. "It creates a bridge between historical events and contemporary challenges, helping visitors understand that immigrant experiences have always created both opportunities and vulnerabilities for families seeking better lives." Ethan had flourished during his time with the museum's history team. His natural curiosity and ability to make connections between historical documents had impressed even seasoned researchers. His work helping decipher damaged ledgers had earned him special commendation, along with a substantial scholarship that would cover his college expenses when he graduated high school the following year. "Dr. Martinez says I have a natural talent for connecting historical dots," he told his mother proudly. "I never would have discovered this if our basement hadn't flooded." The discovery had attracted significant media attention, with local television stations and national newspapers all wanting to tell the story of what the Blackwood family had found and why it mattered. Sarah had initially been uncomfortable with the spotlight, but soon recognized how sharing their story helped amplify the Foundation's mission by highlighting the continued relevance of immigrant struggles for economic security and dignified housing. Lily, Sarah's 9-year-old daughter, had adapted to the changes with the resilience of childhood. Initially confused by the stream of experts and activity surrounding their home, she had quickly embraced their new role as caretakers of history. With her natural artistic talents, she had even contributed illustrations to the children's section of the museum exhibition, depicting how bootleggers had used hidden tunnels to transport illegal alcohol throughout Chicago. At the museum event, Mayor Rodriguez approached to speak with them. As the daughter of Mexican immigrants, she was particularly interested in the Foundation's work and its connection to Chicago's complex immigrant history. "The Blackwood family," the mayor said with a smile as she shook Sarah's hand. "Chicago thanks you not just for finding something historic, but for what you chose to do with it." Sarah felt a surge of pride, not because of the praise, but because they had made choices that honored both history and contemporary needs. "We just tried to do the right thing," she said simply. "To respect what we found while using it to help families facing challenges today." "That's exactly why people connect with your story," the mayor replied. "In a time when self-interest often dominates, you've shown that historical responsibility and present-day compassion can work together." After the event, they returned to their home on Lakeview Avenue. The house that once seemed like an overwhelming burden was now a symbol of their journey and a piece of living history. The repairs had been completed with meticulous attention to historical accuracy while incorporating modern comforts and efficiencies. The basement that had once been filled with murky floodwater was now clean and properly waterproofed, with a specially designed viewing area where visitors could safely see the entrance to the tunnel while protecting both the house's integrity and the historical site. The museum team continued their research on the tunnel, making new discoveries about its construction and contents that further illuminated the story of the Jenna brothers and their operation. Archaeological excavations had revealed that the tunnel had once connected to a nearby building that had served as a front for receiving illegal alcohol shipments, creating a complete picture of how the bootlegging operation had functioned during Prohibition. That evening, as the family ate dinner in their newly renovated kitchen, Sarah looked at her children with a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. She saw how much more secure and confident they seemed compared to the dark days of financial struggle before their discovery. Finding what was hidden behind their basement wall had not only provided financial stability, but had given them a sense of purpose and connection that had strengthened them as a family. "I've been thinking," Lily said after dinner, "about how lucky we were that our basement flooded. If it hadn't, we never would have found the tunnel, and we might have lost our house." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "It's strange to think that what seemed like our worst problem turned out to be our greatest blessing." Ethan, always thoughtful beyond his years, added, "Maybe that's the real lesson in all this. Sometimes what looks like disaster is actually the beginning of something important." The Jenna brothers probably thought they failed when most of them were killed, and their plans for legitimacy fell apart. But 100 years later, their hidden assets are helping immigrant families build better lives through our foundation. His words resonated deeply with Sarah. Throughout her life, she had viewed challenges as obstacles to be overcome through determination and hard work. But the past 6 months had taught her that sometimes adversity could open doors to possibilities that would otherwise remain hidden. That crisis might be the catalyst for transformation rather than simply a threat to survival. The foundation they had established was growing beyond its initial focus on housing assistance to include entrepreneurship training, advocacy for immigrant rights, and community development initiatives in Chicago's evolving neighborhoods. What had begun as a way to address their own housing crisis was becoming a movement for immigrant empowerment that honored the complex legacy of the Jenna brothers while transforming their ill-gotten gains into legitimate opportunities for today's struggling families. 1 year after their basement flooded, the Blackwoods hosted an open house to showcase their restored home and raise funds for the foundation. The event featured guided tours of the tunnel entrance area for donors to the Immigrant Housing Fund. As Sarah welcomed guests and shared their story, she noticed how many different people found meaning in it: young immigrant families struggling to afford housing in Chicago's expensive market, historians passionate about preserving the city's complex past, and community advocates working to maintain affordable housing in gentrifying neighborhoods. They all connected with the narrative of ordinary people caught in larger economic forces yet finding ways to preserve dignity and build futures. "Your story gives people hope," said Reverend Diaz, whose church worked with the foundation to identify families in need. "Not just because you found treasure, but because you showed that doing the right thing can lead to unexpected blessings, even in the darkest moments." By the end of the event, they had raised enough funding to help 25 more families secure stable housing, bringing the total assisted in the first year to over 120. Each family helped carried forward the legacy that the Jenna brothers had attempted to build, supporting immigrant communities during times of transition and hardship, but now through legitimate means that built up rather than undermined society. Later that night, after the guests had left and Lily had gone to bed, Sarah and Ethan sat in the living room reflecting on their journey. "I was so scared we would lose everything," Sarah admitted, remembering how desperate she had felt in that flooded basement with the condemnation notice in her hand. "I couldn't see any way forward." "And now we're helping other families find their way forward," Ethan said happily. His work with the foundation had given him purpose beyond typical teenage concerns. "From bootlegging to building futures," Sarah said, quoting the foundation's motto. "We're doing what the Jennas wanted to do, just in a different time and a better way." Ethan nodded, thinking about how help and opportunity flowed through time from Italian immigrants who had turned to crime during Prohibition to his family, now helping a new generation of immigrants with similar dreams but legitimate paths. Different eras, different challenges, but the same fundamental human desire to build security and opportunity for family and community. What they had found behind their basement wall had changed their family's trajectory, turning potential disaster into unexpected blessing. But more importantly, it had connected them to a larger story of redemption that extended beyond their personal circumstances. The flood that had nearly cost them their home had instead revealed foundations deeper than their house. Foundations of resilience, transformation, and the human capacity to turn adversity into opportunity. As Sarah looked around the home they had nearly lost, and now would keep for generations, she knew the real treasure wasn't the currency or old documents, as valuable as they were. The real treasure was the legacy they had inherited from men they had never met but whose unfulfilled ambitions for legitimacy and community support now lived on, through the foundation bearing their family name. The flood that had seemed like their worst nightmare had shown them that sometimes help comes from looking deeper, not just behind walls, but into history and human motivation. The crisis that had threatened to destroy everything had instead connected them to a larger story of immigrant struggle and aspiration that now continued through their own actions. As Chicago prepared for sleep outside their windows, the Blackwoods understood that they had become part of something that transcended their individual lives, a continuing effort to ensure that in times of hardship, communities found ways to support their vulnerable members, creating circles of opportunity and dignity that extended through time like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The bootleggers' tunnel hidden behind their basement wall had preserved not just currency and historical documents, but principles that remained as valuable in the 21st century as they had been in the 20th, that communities thrive when they support their members, that adversity can be the beginning of transformation, and that ordinary individuals acting with conviction can create legacies that continue long after they are gone. The flood had receded, but the legacy would flow forever forward, touching lives far beyond what the Jenner brothers could have imagined when they created their hidden chamber of concealment. And the Blackwood family, once on the verge of losing everything, had found something far more valuable than money. They had found their place in a continuing story of redemption, resilience, and possibility that would outlast even the currency that had changed their fortunes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.